Hey everybody, Pete Bludworth with the Corrections Unfiltered, where corrections meets conversation. Very lucky today to be sitting with Dr. Roy Bedard. We have been associates and friends, gosh, probably for 30 years. I've learned a lot from Roy. I met him back when I was new in corrections, and I was learning a lot of different things that were outside of my agency. And one of the tools that I first started practicing with or learning was the Rapid Rotation Baton. And fortunately, we had mutual friends and who introduced me to Roy. And then I was able to learn how to use the baton, not from a trainer, but from the person who invented it. So, Roy, welcome to Corrections Unfiltered. Would you like to kind of give us a little bit about your history?
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, I mean, I've got a varied history, but let's talk about all those years ago when we met. My history really was in the martial arts. I started practicing martial arts when I was all of 12 years old and ran a karate school for a long time, and I became a competitor, made the United States karate team, and started doing a lot of traveling, and that kind of gave me a global perspective of what I was really interested in from the martial arts, and that was the self-defense component. So later, when I was a very old person, 19, I decided that I was going to join law enforcement because I felt like I could express myself best there. It was an opportunity for me to be able to take the knowledge that I had developed as a young martial artist, running a martial arts school, having an avid interest in self-defense, and to share it with a group of people that actually used it, unlike other martial artists, who oftentimes, they practice many times a week, but, rarely find themselves in a fight. And that's not the same, of course, for people who are in public safety, including, law enforcement, corrections, military, security services, things like that. So that's where I began to associate myself and sort of create an identity as a young man. It was just about that time, really, as I got into law enforcement, because I think of my notoriety being a U.S. team member on the karate team, that I was quickly drafted into law enforcement's in-service training division. And so I began teaching law enforcement officers, not only the incumbents in service, but also at the academy as they came in. And I was teaching defensive tactics, and I was teaching use of force, and then many years later began to actually become a subject matter expert with the state and composed the state's curriculum, which is still being used today in some parts. And when I say some parts, what I mean is some components of the curriculum all these years later is still my original writing. So it has become my life study to understand the martial arts, to understand self-defense, and then certainly to understand the tools that are oftentimes used for subject control. I guess my thoughts when I was younger was that understanding that law enforcement officers were going to be placed in conflict on a regular basis, that I really started to take seriously the safety component of what it was that we were doing. Not only the empty-handed techniques, but the things that we were using. At that time, even pepper spray, we're talking about back in the late 80s, pepper spray hadn't really even made the scene. Right. Batons were either straight or side handles, rich with problems, whether you wanted an offense or a defensive baton. You had to pick kind of between the two of them. The collapsibles hadn't made their entry into the market. Tasers were still many years away. So back then, law enforcement officers actually had to learn how to fight. I mean, there were times where a law enforcement officer would find themselves against somebody much bigger, or perhaps multiple attackers, and they had to have actual skills. I'm not saying they don't have to have skills today, but it's certainly much different because of the tools that we have and because of the training that we find ourselves subject to. And so we can discuss that separately, but whether training has gotten better or worse because of technology. I think some would argue that it has gotten worse because law enforcement and correctional officers oftentimes become over-reliant on certain tools. So I was using a mechanical widget, just like an extension of your body. So if your body couldn't do it, you sure couldn't do it with any of the batons or any other equipment at that time. So there was a skill that I took pride in teaching, but to really accommodate sort of the efficacy of a human body, I had to change the shape of the baton. First thing I had to do was make it both offensive and defensive, and that was the original theme when I created the Rapid Rotation Baton, which if you look at it, you know anything about martial arts, you know that it resembles a Japanese sai. It's not a sai, it has a lot of differences, but certainly the sai as it is still used is used for both offensive striking and defensive blocking. And so that was the basis for my idea. I met up with a couple individuals that were engineers, Bill Rogers and his counterpart Norman Clifton, and brought them my idea. They said, "Well, this is great. You gotta get it patented." At the time, I had it made out of a broomstick and coat hangers wrapped with tape, so it was very crude. I still have it, by the way. But when I went to a patent attorney and explained what I had, why I thought it was important, he got a little excited about it. And before I knew it, I was drafting a patent for consideration by the U.S. courts. And, well, long story short, the patent got granted. And at that point, then Bill and Norman both decided that they were going to help this poor, struggling young law enforcement officer get into the market. And so they facilitated my growth by actually funding a lot of the project. I had to build tooling. I had to build a variety of molds. This was a unique baton because it didn't hang in a cheap ring. It was actually in a security holster, so you could treat it much like you would a firearm, where not only were you using the tool itself, but when it was static and in place, it was safe because of its holster. And that's where they really specialize. These are the guys that created most of the Safariland products. The original Boss 3 Safariland holster, if you remember that, going back a lot of years, was Bill Rogers' design. And then, of course, later on, it became the SS3 and then the 6280 holster. And, you know, today the rotating hood. Those are all Rogers designs. And those are the technology that's built into our holster as well. So, of course, the next step for a young, struggling, poor police officer was to try to earn some of that money back. And that took me out of full-time policing after about 10 years and put me on the road. And this is where we met. We started meeting at conferences for the first time, where I got out there and I decided, you know, I was going to show my product not only to the United States, but to the world. I'll just say one thing about that. I spent most of my time outside of the United States, actually, because of the fact that we are a decentralized law enforcement and corrections system. You know, I was selling widgets, a baton and holster. And when you have smaller agencies, 20, 30, 50, 100, 250, and you make a sale, it's still not a lot of product. You know, if you went international, if you went to Germany or Korea, where I had offices, or Mexico, where I had an office, you'd make a sale and it would be in the order of thousands. And so I spent most of my time outside of the United States, not because I necessarily preferred to or thought that they could use the product more, but it was just from a straight revenue perspective. These were fine police officers. I enjoyed working with them, but I could make big sales. And then, of course, as I started to make money at this product, I brought myself back home. And when I got back home, I started to cover much of the law enforcement and corrections agencies here in the United States. And this is where you became very instrumental to me by introducing me to the Federal Bureau of Prisons.
You know, it was an interesting time. You're right, because I remember in the 90s, you know, we were saying OC wasn't prevalent in corrections at the time. The PR-24 was mainly the baton that was being used in, you know, the Bureau of Prisons or other correctional agencies. It was a very small thing, but it was beginning to catch notice. They were starting to see, hey, there's other things that we can use, like this pepper spray stuff. And there's been a whole evolutionary process behind that product. And then you have, well, maybe we should start introducing these other less lethal impact munitions. And then there was we were looking for, what can we change about the way we do things? I know my experience, and it was great timing to have met you, was we needed to find something different, because we were using the PR-24 at a few of our facilities, mainly our metropolitan detention centers, our city detention centers, where they were using the PR-24. But it was a cumbersome type item, and it really was, like you said, in my opinion, it was limited in what you could do as far as the offensive side of it. It was mainly a stick that people would bring out because they knew they could protect their forearm, and then what they would do with it from there, who really knows? Now, your Supermax your prisons, they also had the 30-inch straight stick, but good stick, used for decades. However, was it really practical for the things that we were needing to do in corrections now? So it was a really neat time in the 90s, I think, because I was part of, luckily, meeting you and meeting some other people who were trying to innovate and take these munitions or whatever, this less lethal technology and techniques, and get it going into corrections. What was it about that whole time frame that really, you talked about how it captured you, you developed it, and off you went to do it. But there had to be some kind of a passion inside for the safety of officers and other people. You had a passion for it that was new to me, and I really caught on to that.
I think I came along also at the right time. I mean, it was just sort of that time in law enforcement and corrections when our professions were really starting to develop post 1960. Right. So all of a sudden we had the civil rights movement, and suddenly, everyone was paying attention to law enforcement and corrections and what we did. So we had to figure out how to do it better. We had to figure out how to do it safer. We also realized that the rebound effect from that in the 1970s of getting in, I'll say, professional trouble with our use of force, which is generally unrestricted, resulted in the highest number of law enforcement officers killed that we've ever had in this country. And so now you're coming into the 1980s with sort of this legacy that's developing. And when you get into law enforcement and you take a look at those numbers, I mean, it's hard now, all these years later, to understand the mood in law enforcement, which was that everyone was not only afraid of getting hurt, but they were afraid of getting sued. And so I think when I went to the academy, a lot of that stuff, I was sort of indoctrinated in that world of it's got to work, but at the same time it can't work too well, or you end up getting yourself sued. And so I was young and creative, and I thought, gosh, there's a better way to do these things. When I got out on their mats and I was exposed to law enforcement gear for the first time, whether it was handcuffs or batons or whatever we had during those days, I kept immediately, because of my background in subject control, I thought there's a better way to do this. So I was passionate, I think, in general about certainly being a competitor and having a martial arts school and always trying to find sort of the right way to do things. I've also, been very interested in sort of the academic side of subject control, learning about anatomy, learning about subject control from the perspective of the joint manipulation and nerve control. And remember, at that time we had a group of folks out there with pressure point control tech, and so Bruce Siddle's group did a huge favor to us all by sort of turning our attention away from sort of the external application to a more internal application. Like, what is it that I'm doing that's causing these individuals to comply? And that became sort of a mantra for me, and certainly for a lot of law enforcement officers, in particular law enforcement and corrections trainers, to figure out how we could get control of somebody without seriously injuring them, without seriously hurting them. That's easy. Hurting somebody is easy, certainly if you have a background in tactics, whether it be an inmate or it be somebody on the street. But that's not our charge. Our charge is to do it safely. And so that fire, I suppose, of wanting to know how to do that was what led to my passion, I think, to realize that there was a better way, and almost to even understand back then that I was at sort of the foundation of something it was a snowball effect that, as I said, came from the 60s, had rolled into the 70s, had told us about the dangers of being a law enforcement officer, had told us about the dangers of civil lawsuits, and all of that sort of momentum that had happened professionally within our professions ignited me. It ignited a young man that had a lot of vigor and a lot of energy to get out there and sort of change things. And so that's what I intended to do. And of course, my biggest problem as any creative person out there is, how do I get started? I mean, where do I know anything about business? Of course, I didn't know I'd have any money. I didn't know anything about engineering or molding or making products or any of that kind of stuff. So I had to learn all that. That also fueled my passion, because suddenly I was learning something I knew nothing about. And there's nothing probably more exciting than, learning something for the first time. And there was so much to learn. So I think that's the long answer to a very short question. Why was I so passionate? But it was all these sort of things coming together at one moment that gave me an opportunity to involve myself professionally in a way that was grand and to this day still sort of resonates with almost everything I do.
So I want to capture that moment, because you're absolutely right. I remember how we all were. I remember the other people in the training groups that we would meet at conferences, or we would go wherever, and we'd all get together. I was lucky because I got to go through the training. So I'm pulling pieces of this person's program, and I felt so lucky. I felt so alive, because I was at the forefront of an agency, and I was mixed with these great professionals who were not tied into the same training. It didn't matter if I was in an agency training, if I went to this facility for the training, I went to that facility to training. It was the same echo chamber. everybody was doing the same thing. Everybody repeated the same skills. However, when I start running into you and a few of the other people, I'm like, well, check this out. And I think for me, like you're talking about that passion, that's what I caught fire on. I thought, I am learning things that no one else in my agency has seen. I have got to capture the essence and the spirit of what's going on here so I can be the proper spokesperson for it. But what I really appreciated about the training that you gave, and I think if I could go back and encapsulate that time, I would say you made us smarter trainers because you explained why things worked. And what's even just as important as me being able to explain it, when I took the baton or your RapidCuffs and I was showing the people the techniques and how to use them, the whys were part of that actual device. It's not like you made up some kind of a concept and, hey, here's a stick, figure it out. Everything that you taught and the way that you taught it and what it was designed for worked because of the design of the baton, the design of the RapidCuffs. And that changed everything for me. And that's what launched me to be so different, because I had all this and nobody else was really paying attention to it. Did you get any pushback from it? Because like you talked about, you've got collapsibles that are trying to come out because they're supposed to be the fix to all problems. You got the PR24 and people are just wanting to hang on to that because it replaced straight sticks.
Yeah, tons of it. I mean, it started that way. And, you know, I think it's also important to mention, as we talk about the history of our profession, we're a paramilitary organization. And paramilitary organizations are allergic to change. I think you know that, as I see that Marine sign behind you. We don't like change. It's difficult, it's hard to understand, it sometimes is costly, not only in terms of what we now know, but what we might find out when we incorporate something new. I had all of that pushback. Having a paramilitary background, it was a little bit taboo for you to sort of question the status quo. And where I think I had a problem was that I had a full understanding of self-defense, as I mentioned previously, and I wanted to develop a full defensive programs. I didn't see that tools should be just part of a continuum. I thought tools should actually be capable of running the entire continuum, you know, for everything from talking as you have your tool on your body to, if necessary, using deadly force. And so I applied that to these constructs of force continuum and developed a training course, which I think is what captured a lot of people. They said, hey, you can use a baton at all these different levels. And that hadn't been really discussed. It was generally understood that if you were going to use a baton or if you were going to use a handcuff or today your pepper spray, that they fit in snugly into one sort of category on the force matrix. Mine didn't do that. It bled over from place to place, and it really went back to the user, not the tool itself. And that became really critical. So I think that as I headed down the road of pushback, I always had an argument that was compelling. In other words, why wouldn't you want this? If this failed, then just use it differently. If it fails like this, use it differently. Don't necessarily discard it and try something else. Sometimes you have to do that. I mean, there are times where you're going from an empty-handed, subject control situation to a deadly force situation. Not to say the baton can't be used for deadly force, but it's not a primary tool. It certainly can, and I would teach deadly force tactics with it. But having the ability to transition along a continuum of escalation and de-escalation, that was my passion. It was about getting something in somebody's hands that when they had it in their hands, they could walk out to the street or into the facility and feel confident. Confidence matters in use of force and defensive tactics. It turns out that, when we are attacked, when we are assaulted in uniform, generally people are bigger than us, or there are more than us. This is something that, goes back to probably our biology, the way that we perceive threats, which I talk a lot about in the courtroom today. So I wanted a tool that was able to equal the score. I mean, Colt was the first one to really do that. I think the old saying that, God created man, but Colt made them equal, resonated with me, even with the lesser tools. We needed to be equal with the tools that we had. So I put most of my time and creativity into coming up with tactics and techniques that were capable of doing the things that needed to be done in the field, while at the same time offering confidence to the user and providing an advantage over someone who didn't have my tools. And this is how, after years and even decades, I finally cut through this resistance to change, because most people realize that whether you were carrying, for example, a collapsible baton, which is all about how comfortable it is to carry and not about its tactical effectiveness, or a PR-24, which is incredibly limited to defensive techniques and not offensive, or the straight stick, which is incredibly limited to offensive techniques and not very much defensive. All of those things could be kind of combined together to where you could have a solid tool, not a collapsible, that you could carry as comfortably, that you could use offensively, you could use defensively. Gosh, you could even use it on the ground. We have a whole ground fight program with the Rapid Rotation Baton. That had never been done before.
Yeah.
You can use it against grips, grabs, and body holds when somebody actually has control of your body. This baton has competency in those areas. It can be used for the more traditional strikes. It can be used for more traditional blocks, but with more control. So those were the things I was trying to do, is brush everything up, show the world that despite the fact that they didn't want to change, it was time to change. We were moving forward with technology. We were moving forward with philosophy about use of force and defensive tactics. And I wanted to be the harbinger of what was to come.
If we want to go back in that period of time, it wasn't too late into the 2000s, early 2000s, I should say, early in the 2000s, that we put together a pilot program. So I was fortunate to be at a facility that was using the straight stick baton, and they wanted to convert into something else. And I remember my warden, he called me on the phone and says, "Hey, where's that funny little stick you got?" Took it over, did a quick little demo of it to somebody who said, "Hey, let's try doing a pilot program on this." Fortunately for all of us, there was the gentleman who's over pilot programs of technology had your baton, and it was in his office for like 2 years, and he couldn't get anybody to pay attention to it. Nobody knew how to use it. They just looked at it. And then he finds out, I know how to use this thing, and the pilot program took off.
I have to tell you, I mean, this is the time during my progressive sort of introduction of the baton into the field that you were starting to teach me everything. And at that point, it really was about application. Remember, I was a street police officer, so the rules were different, right? I mean, who we came up against, what we were able to do, what we knew about them before we actually engaged with them. Suddenly, here we are in a corrections environment. I was teaching defensive tactics to corrections at the academy. I knew something about it. I wasn't completely lost. But when you start getting into the confinement of a cell, for example, when you're doing extractions, those are things that I had no experience with. Why would I? I was a street police officer. And so you really taught me about how to take this tool that was, a bit like the Swiss Army knife of batons, and apply it in an environment that I had not considered, certainly with the degree of precision that just came natural to you because you were already so experienced in that world. So it was really the perfect collaboration. It turned out that in some ways I think that the baton may even be better for corrections than it is for law enforcement because of the different circumstances that I now know about. And our pilot program, as you said, took off really with your charge, not with mine. I had the device. I could go in there and teach it. I certainly could, I think, wow them with understanding why it was developed the way that it was, and to talk about how it transitioned the force continuum, how we could escalate and de-escalate. But your application of the baton in an environment that our students really understood was what caused it to catch fire. And I think this is when FBOP decided to make a larger order, and then we went for a full pilot, and then next thing I knew we were system wide. So every prison could use our baton, and that was really all you're doing.
I appreciate you saying that, but I have to say it was more than the, and I don't want to discount the baton. It was the mindset that you establish in the training was so different. Like I said, I had been to many trainings by then, taught by great people. However, it was the same information, just told by a different person. The same training concepts. I remember, some of the gas mask training was just like I got in the Marine Corps. Here's a whole bunch of gas. Take your gas mask off. Suffer pain your way through it. Put your gas mask back on. But the way that you talked about training, it was you instilled people's confidence that they knew what they were saying. They weren't saying, oh, you use this because of that. They knew why they used this because of that. That's the difference. And I believe that that was because when we did that pilot program, we were very careful to make sure that we taught it correctly. So that way when they left and they're talking amongst a group of people saying, this will never work and we don't need this thing because we already got something, they were able to have a confident, intelligent conversation to say why this one would be better for them. Because it was a trial and error period at a facility that had faced tragedies in the past. So they weren't an easy crowd to turn. You couldn't just get them to say, okay, let's do this. They had to be convinced. So that group of people that went after that first training session we had as basic users, they had to be the right spokespeople. They couldn't have been the right spokespeople unless we followed your training concepts, mindset, and format.
Just sort of echoing what we said previously, and I think you reiterate this point, where a paramilitary organization being creative in the military is not a good idea. The old saying, mine is not to question why, mine is just to do or die, is a famous military saying. You don't question status quo. You don't question why you do it. Your job is to do it like your instructor told you to, and there's a reason for that. I mean, part of the esprit de corps, part of the accountability, part of sticking with things that have worked in the past that are sort of narrowed down into now the training program. When you look at things like Hick's Law that says, the more things that you know, the less competent you sometimes become. The military is very wise about that. And so it went so far to the wisdom of don't do anything new that we just sort of sat on our toadstools for many, many years, and no one questioned the existing training. The problem with the existing training, as I said, is that it was really given by people who were sort of, I think, philosophically locked into, this is a baton and it does baton things. This is a handcuff and it does handcuff things. No, this is a tool that can be used in a lot of different ways. That was the difference. That was sort of the groundbreaking moment. And I think, to your point, that when I trained your instructors to think that way, there was suddenly a motivation or excitement. You used the word of passion that was very noticeable during, the time that I was training them, and also, of course, when they successfully completed the course and graduated. And they carried that with them. And I have no doubt that after I left the facility, after those several days, that it was your work and their work, that passion. Once again, we lit the fuse that led to me later getting the phone call saying, "Hey, we're blowing this thing up. It's going to get bigger than just this little pilot program that we started off with." So I think there is a reason why it happened, and I think I've echoed this point now many times, and you have as well. It was different. It was new. It was unique, and it was real. It dealt with real problems in the facility. It dealt with real problems that correctional officers knew that they didn't have solutions for, and suddenly they had hope that there was a solution to circumstances that perhaps kept them up at night, and I think that was the reason why it went so well.
Yeah, absolutely, because it was all staff in the facility were trained in it, so it wasn't a specialized little team. It was everybody, and eventually, as it was spread out across the agency, it was everybody who worked at those facilities. And I was very proud as I moved around the agency after that for the next 20 years or so. I was able to see the baton at other facilities, different trainers, what they were doing, and the concepts that you taught, the mindset that you taught was still being conveyed. So, it didn't get watered down by a new group of people deciding that they're just going to inject their own stuff into it. It stayed and remained the same, and I hope it has, today. I also want to talk to you about the RapidCuff, because there's rigid cuffs out there. There's a reason why you can get this rigid cuff, or you can get a hinge cuff if you want to have that less flexibility, where you don't have the chain. But there's something different about the RapidCuff. Do you mind kind of going down it a little bit and talking about what its design was for?
So the RapidCuff is the original. I mean, for all the rigid cuffs that are out there, they're all copies essentially of the RapidCuff. This was originally designed by Dennis Elam, a trainer out of Kansas who worked with me for many years. He had a product called the Quick Cuff, and then later it got knocked off in England, and then it started to get knocked off over here. I later inserted the little black box component to it, and now that's been knocked off. So all of these rigid cuffs that you see, even the ones that fold and then lock into a rigid position, carry my design. And so I just want to get that on record that these are not the original. The original cuff that Dennis Elam designed was based on the idea that handcuffs, once again going back to innovation and creativity and need, was based on the idea that handcuffs were temporary restraining devices. And boy, they were temporary, because all they really did is held your hands close together. They didn't really control your hands, and because of that, they didn't really control you. They just held them sort of close together. And if you had them behind your back and they were close together, certainly you were more restricted in your ability to resist and your ability to perhaps injure an officer or someone else. So the rigid cuff created an opportunity for you to place handcuffs on someone and not give them the same mobility they would have with a chain link cuff, for example. This can also be found in a hinge cuff. They just don't have this sort of rotational aspect, right? They did allow you to sort of close your hand or to pinch. They could certainly allow you to grab somebody around the neck. They could allow you to extract a firearm from a holster if you happen to be around somebody carrying one. They weren't that restrictive, but they were an improvement. So the rigid cuff took all of that away. It didn't allow you to close your hands, and it didn't allow you to rotate your hands. What it did is it created this fixed bar between your wrists, and it gave you an opportunity, if there was resistance, to be able to use the handcuff itself as your defensive tool. So you didn't have to deploy your baton, for example, even if you carried it. You could actually grab that grip with a twist and a push, and we teach all these in the training program, put somebody in a very, very controlled position and do it rapidly. So this RapidCuff idea took off in my mind as being, once again, another improvement on old technology. Now, what we added at RRB Systems International was the secure handcuff case. So when Elam originally had it, he had a handcuff case. It was innovative. It was made of leather. And of course, it had to be different than your average handcuff case because it didn't bend, right? It didn't fit inside of a pouch. But what we did is we were able to build this clamshell holster that held it snugly, securely inside of the shell. And then it had a strap with a sort of a false release on it. The real release was on the inside, where you couldn't visually identify it just by looking at it. And it suddenly made that handcuff more secure because, of course, we didn't want somebody reaching up and just snatching it off your body. It was rigid. On top of that, we also developed a defensive skill in being able to strike people with a handcuff. No one had ever done that before, but now that we had a handcuff that wouldn't fold in your hand, in a pinch, if you needed to use it as an impact weapon, of course you still followed the same impact charts that you would with a baton, but now you're using the handcuff. And how extraordinary was that? If you're out there handcuffing somebody, and it turns out that the statistics in terms of individuals who are going to fight law enforcement officers will choose their time when they're about to be handcuffed. It kind of makes sense because this is the do or die moment, right? Especially on the street. They're not really sure if they're going to get off or if you're going to take them to jail, but when the cuffs come out, they start to know, okay, I'm going to jail. And this, of course, creates a form of desperation that often results in a defensive aggression. So this is the time when law enforcement officers often find themselves encumbered with this clumsy chain cuff, and now they got to fight. What are you going to do? The rigid cuff didn't have that problem. You could actually use it as a striking tool. So the ability to restrain somebody more than temporarily, the ability to use a handcuff as a control device while it was on them, the ability to use the handcuff as a defensive tool when it wasn't on them, the ability to hold a handcuff securely on the belt system for really the first time ever. Those are all the things that suddenly, once again, lit a fire with the people I was teaching. And they're like, well, why didn't we have this thing 20 years ago? Why didn't we have this thing 10 years ago? And of course, the Bureau, I think, having more confidence in RRB systems because of the baton, because we'd gone down that road, was quick to adopt it. They said, well, this is a better tool too. And so today, they're still probably my biggest customer. Every year I send out lots and lots of rapid cuffs. They've been all over the FBOP, Guantanamo Bay, and other parts of the world. So some of the most vicious people, I suppose, in the world have worn the rapid cuff in their confinement. And so I'm proud of that because the results and the reports from the field are very, very positive in terms of how it has really probably saved lives on more than one occasion.
I can tell you because I've used both. I've used both in response to inmates who are being disruptive. I noticed that I was able to take control, like I can remember it right now like it was yesterday, where the guy kept his hands up underneath. He was mad. He wasn't being actively resistant beyond that. He's just like, you're not going to get my wrist. No, this is my last stand. You're not going to get my wrist. And I was able to use the Rapid Baton to get inside there and at least get enough movement to where we were able to get that hand back behind and then get the restraints on. I've been on a cell extraction team where before, and you break out that set of handcuffs, who knows what direction it's going in, who knows, you got to wait and grab it, you're hoping that it's going to go right. You never have that problem with the RapidCuff because of the ergonomic design of it. You know when it's in your hand properly, you know where it's at, and when you put it on, you don't have to wonder where the other end is when you're trying to put the second wrist in. It's there. And I just, practical use. Like you said, they have less movement, less mobility of their wrist area. Like they can't jump through them as easily as they can when they have a chain restraint and move them up to the front. There's a lot of purposes for it. And I'm not making a commercial for it. I'm talking about what I've done and how much they meant. Someone asked me the other day, what was it, Pete, about your passion? Every time I heard about you training or I saw you training, you just had this passion. And it was because I believed in what I was saying, and I had the credit to say what I was saying because I'd used them. I'd been in situations where I had to rely upon the baton, where I had to rely upon the handcuffs. I've used them, and that's why I know that they work so well. No, I'm sorry.
Anecdotal. You introduced me to somebody in Washington, D.C. who was in charge of, sort of reviewing products. But it's a funny story because he asked me to send him a pair of the cuffs, and I said, do you want me to do some training? And he said, no, just send the cuffs. We've heard about them. I think he credited you with bringing it to his attention, and so I did. I sent a handcuff, and I thought, well, I don't know how this is going to go. I mean, they require training. He called me back. I don't know. I want to say it was a month later or 2 months later, and he was very kind, and he said, hey, I'm calling you just to let you know that we've completed our field test. And I said, your field test? I mean, we have proper field tests that we've initiated. It begins with training trainers, getting so many of them into the field, and then recording the data in terms of how are they working, is your staff comfortable with them, are there any problems, those kind of things. I knew that he wasn't equipped to do a proper field test. And what's funny about this story is that he said, I said to him, what field test? He said, well, there was one guy that we couldn't keep in handcuffs. You might remember this story. And he said, every time we put him in handcuffs, whether it was behind his back, he'd get him to the front, he'd end up prying them open on some piece of metal that was on the inside of his cell, and he'd hand them back to us. And he just made fun with it. And he told me, he said he had these really big wrists. And he said, and when I asked you for the handcuffs, we wanted to put those on him. And he was our field test. And I said, oh, well, how did it do? He said, he's still in them. And so he said, we'd like to order some. And so it passed like this big test based on this one individual that apparently had a habit of breaking handcuffs and getting out of them. There's nothing it seemed that they could do to keep them in it. It's a great anecdotal story because, sometimes it does boil down to that, So, when you're studying things scientifically, you say on average, right? On average. How are things working on average? That's typically what you're looking for during a proper field test. It's not going to do everything perfect, and it's not going to, do everything imperfect. So on average, how are they working? But every now and then you get, what we call, once again in science, this outlier, this one person that's doing something that nobody else is doing. He's breaking handcuffs, and you cannot keep him in handcuffs. It doesn't matter how you cuff him. It doesn't matter where you cuff him. He gets out of them. So he is, he's 3 to 4 standard deviations to the right in terms of his ability to break out of handcuffs. Yeah. And he presents probably alone one of the biggest challenges for adopting a new product. That product could have failed, but it didn't, and it stayed on him. And so it became, this sort of big moment to say, if this works on him, we should expect that on average it's going to work on everyone. And that's kind of how it went. And I never really thought about, doing field tests like that, and I don't necessarily recommend them because there's not always one of those guys, that you can test it on. But it turned out, once again, he came along at the right time.
Roy, you've great products, training has come this far. Do you have anything coming up on the horizon?
Well, I spend most of my time nowadays talking about use of force and defensive tactics. I'm a little bit older. I'm not always on the mats like I used to be. That was my whole life back then. I do a lot of expert witness work. I talk about police use of force, corrections use of force, and of course, Florida being the first state to adopt stand your ground. Now I spend a lot of time talking about stand your ground issues. And I've worked for both the defense, I've worked for prosecutors in criminal cases, in civil cases, I work for the plaintiff, I work for the defendant. I like to call balls and strikes, and oftentimes it's almost always about self-defense, but sometimes it's involving equipment, sometimes it's involving products, which gives me even more of a global perspective. When it comes to building new products, I have some thoughts about that. I don't know necessarily what comes next. There's some new devices out there. I saw the other day a shock glove. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Mm-hmm. Somebody has built. It's interesting. I would like to study it myself to see what its efficacy is. But it seems to me that probably the future of subject control is going to be a continuation of what we've seen from Taser, now moving into something like a shock glove. I think the crudeness of the Taser, of actually firing darts into someone, is the next big step. Taking that away, somehow coming up with, I guess, what Star Trek would call a phaser, some way of being able to insert enough electricity to immobilize without causing serious harm. Mm-hmm. To me, that seems like the next big product, and it's been the next big product since the development of the Taser. I don't necessarily think we're going to come up with, better aerosols, or I don't, safer aerosols than the ones that we have. I don't necessarily think that we are going to go back to the time where we were teaching police and corrections officers to become reliant on their own empty hand skills. I think we've kind of passed that. We are looking for the right tool to do the job. So that's sort of my premonition of where I think this thing is heading. And I think some young aspiring person, perhaps starting off like I started off, will come up with that next big step of being able to immobilize safely someone from a distance where neither they nor the individual they're immobilizing suffer permanent harm. So that's just sort of a wrap up, I guess, of where I think we're heading with I'll call them less than lethal tools.
But you still have your products, you still got your RapidCuff, still got your Rapid Baton. How can people reach out to you to try to organize some training or get information on getting training, so they can, if it's not implemented, they can go through maybe a pilot program and get it implemented? Or how can they get recertified? How do they get in touch with you?
So I think, the best way to get a hold of us now is on the internet. Everything seems to be moving in that direction. They can find the product at rrbsystems.com. You can purchase them online. You don't even have to be a law enforcement officer. You can, hopefully be somebody who's in the public safety business, but I don't check for that either. These are, basic tools like any other tool that an individual can buy and possess. You can use them for self-defense. I know some people that do carry them, for example, in their car for self-defense purposes. Some people keep them in their homes for self-defense purposes. If you are looking to bring it on as an agency, then of course the recommendation is that you do a group training, that somehow we set up either a pilot program for you, which I think we might even be past that. I think so many agencies have used it that I'm not sure that we necessarily need to pilot it every time unless there's something unusual about that agency that needs to be examined. But I do think setting up training is nothing more than getting online, sending an email, letting me assign a trainer to the training. We just pick out the dates, and when we show up, and at that point teach the students the same thing we've always taught them, which is a full continuum of subject control, escalation, de-escalation, talking about proportionality, and getting them to sort of adopt these ideas that are prevalent in the use of both the baton and the handcuff, and hopefully move them from whatever tools they're using into what I'll call a more complete self-defense system.
Well, I want to let you know that, I know we've been friends for a long time, but you've been a great mentor to me. You've always been someone I can reach out and talk to, bad ideas off of. You give me so many different perspectives on how to see things. And I very much value that. And I believe that that's what gave me, or that's what separated me from others that I was around, was because of your mindset that you gave me. the idea is the opportunity to at least talk about things and go all the way through it, full picture. So I appreciate this opportunity to sit down and talk with you. And I really want to make sure that we just let people know about your history, where you came from, what you've done, the changes that you've made in law enforcement, the changes that you've made in the mindset of training, just what you've accomplished in that one part. But like you said, there's so many other parts. There's also roybedard.com people can go to if they want to see more about you. So I really look forward to hopefully this audience will decide to go out and check out your stuff, start getting some training organized, and we'll see where the future takes both of us, huh?
Thanks, Pete. I sure appreciate you giving me an opportunity to talk to your audience.
Thank you, Roy. Thanks for being here.